Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the Managing Director of Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, and I'm very pleased to welcome you today to our research seminar series. Today, we'll be featuring two Joint Center researchers sharing their work that's still in progress on COVID, race, and housing insecurity, looking at how the economic impacts of the pandemic have exacerbated housing insecurity, particularly for racial and ethnic folks. Just as a reminder, this is a part of, we have a few more events left this semester. So following this, we have one more housing research seminar, which will be on Friday, December 3rd, which will feature Adam Travis, a PhD candidate in sociology and social policy, who's also a Meyer dissertation fellow at the Joint Center. And he'll be speaking about his work assessing the landscape of corporate ownership of small rental properties. We also have one other public event remaining on Tuesday, November 30th at 4:30 p.m. An event, Can We Finally Close Racial Homeownership Gaps? Insight from 3 new initiatives. And this will feature Nikitra Bailey of the National Fair Housing Alliance, Doreen Graves of the Tennessee Housing Development Agency, and Crystal Cornegay of Mass Housing. We'll be speaking about initiatives they're involved in. NHFA is working nationally, but also in Columbus, Memphis, and Detroit. Doreen is working in Memphis, and Crystal is working in Massachusetts. So that should be a very interesting event. I hope you can join us for that. But today, as I said, we will have Sharon Cornelissen, who is a postdoctoral fellow here at the center, and Alex Hermann, a senior research analyst, who will be sharing their work. I will note that we will be taking questions through the question and answer feature of the Zoom webinar. You can type your questions in there. We will do our best to answer them once we get to the Q&A portion after Sharon and Alex have finished their presentation. I will tell you, we do have a lot of people who participate in the webinar and more questions than we can answer. So we will do our best to answer your questions, but please understand that we can't possibly get to them all. And this event is available closed captioned. There is a live transcript button, I believe, at the bottom of your Zoom screen where you can turn that on or off. And if you have any other technical questions, you can put those through the Q&A and we will do our best to help you. Just as I mentioned, this is work in progress. And so the paper is not yet available. It will be forthcoming in the coming months. So stay tuned to the Joint Center. If you're not already registered through our website for notices, please do so, and you will be notified when the paper is put out as a working paper. But the event will be recorded and posted to our website in the next few days. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Alex Hermann, who will begin. Alex, it's your show.
Actually, I will begin. But Alex is sharing the screen. Yeah, thank you.
Apologies, Sharon.
No, it's okay. So thank you everyone for attending our presentation. We are very excited to share this work in progress with you all. So we are sharing findings today from our working paper in which we show how racial inequalities shaped housing insecurity during COVID-19, during the second half of 2020. To do so, we draw on household pulse data, which is a nationally representative survey by the Census Bureau that documents the ongoing economic, health, and social impacts of COVID-19. But doing so, we address a much broader question as well, which is what shapes contemporary racial inequalities in housing? One common way that researchers have to think about racial inequalities in housing today has been to look at them through the lens of legacies of historical inequalities and systemic racism. So while rooted in the past, these inequalities persist to this day. An example of this is the Black-white homeownership gap, which is a heritage of historical racial discrimination. For instance, as legally enforced by federal policy. Between the 1930s and the 1960s, the Federal Housing Administration made federally insured subsidized mortgages available for white families only, while it denied credit to Black families and Black neighborhoods, what became known as redlining. These exclusive mortgages fueled the suburbanization of white America And as these white suburban homes very much appreciated in value over time, they allowed white families to build wealth over the next few decades, which they then also could use to help the next generation, their children of white Americans, to buy homes, kind of reproducing this inequality over time. In the meantime, of course, they were denied mortgages. Most Black families remained stuck in aging urban neighborhoods, and they were most of them were not able to buy homes and attain home ownership at this time. So if we look at the contemporary Black-white home ownership gap, which stood at 31% percentage points in 2019, we can understand it partly as a legacy of this unequal history. So this is an example of how historical inequalities are perpetuated to this day and can help us understand racial inequalities in housing today. However, in this talk, we also address a different type of process. Racial inequalities in housing today also get shaped by what we call systemic shocks. So we define systemic shocks as temporary interruptions to the system that unsettle existing pathways that shape social stratification. So examples of systemic shocks are the Great Recession, 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, as well as the pandemic, of course, the focus of our talk today. These systemic shocks often bring to the fore new vulnerabilities and inequalities that were not so significant before this moment. For examples are climate vulnerability, the unique vulnerability of being a subprime borrower, or working in an industry that is, that turned out to be uniquely prone to lockdowns during COVID-19. For that reason, in theory, these systemic shocks have the potential to destabilize existing inequalities and long-standing pathways to inequality. In practice, though, as these systemic shocks happen on the bedrock of existing infrastructures and inequalities, we can also think of them as reinforcing existing societal fault lines. And in practice, they often tend to do this, of course. So in this talk, we address the unique role of systemic shocks, and we show to what extent what we call pre-existing racialized vulnerabilities, so racialized vulnerabilities that are shaped more by these sort of long-standing legacies of racial inequality that I discussed before, and what we call pandemic-induced racial inequalities, which are induced more by the unique systemic shock of the pandemic, shaped who was falling behind on housing payments during the second half of 2020. Specifically, we answer three questions during this talk. First, what racial disparities in housing insecurity existed during the second half of 2020? Second, to what extent were these inequalities shaped by pre-pandemic racial vulnerabilities versus inequalities that were specifically induced by the pandemic? And third, did the systemic shock of the pandemic reinforce or disrupt existing racial inequalities in housing insecurity? So to preface our key findings, we find the following. We find that during the second half of 2020, Black, Hispanic, and Asian households were more likely to fall behind on their housing payments than white households. We find that these inequalities in housing insecurity can partly be explained by what we call pre-pandemic vulnerabilities, so vulnerabilities that already preceded the pandemic, such as differential rates of home ownership, income inequities, and disparities in educational attainment. However, households of color were also more likely to suffer from the economic outfalls of the pandemic specifically, and they more often experienced income losses. And then finally, when they lost income during the pandemic, Black and Hispanic households experienced more severe impacts on housing insecurity compared to white and Asian households. So not only did they experience income loss more often, but the consequences were also more severe for Black and Hispanic households. So in order to do this work, our research draws on previous work by other housing scholars. Notably, there's an important literature on the different ways that families can experience housing insecurity and how this is shaped by racial inequalities. For example, households may experience overcrowding, or multiple families may feel forced to double up in an apartment, such as after eviction. Housing may be inadequate or unhealthy or unsafe. And some households may face severe cost burdens, meaning that they pay 50% or even more of their income months towards housing. They may also experience eviction, forced moves, or homelessness. And these are all examples of what researchers have called housing insecurity. So while housing insecurity then can capture a wide range of experiences, in this talk, when we talk about housing insecurity, we focus specifically on those households that reported being behind on their rent or mortgage payments during the pandemic. We chose to look at this measure as late housing payments became especially acute during the height of COVID-19 economic fallouts, and also became an explicit focus of policy interventions, such as eviction and mortgage and foreclosure moratoria, as well as the emergency rental assistance program. So it became an explicit site of policy intervention. And also, we also chose to look at this measure because it allowed us to look at homeowners with payments and renters in one measure together and combine these two groups. There's been previous work that allows us to kind of think about how racial inequalities can structure who is late in their housing payments. And it has highlighted important racialized vulnerabilities. This includes the racial homeownership gap, as I sort of talked about before. Homeowners are less likely to be late in their housing payments than renters, as well as the role of wealth, income, and educational gaps. So the COVID-19 pandemic both reinforced these pre-existing racial inequalities in housing insecurity, but also induced new inequalities, which were shaped by the specific nature of this public health and economic crisis. So in the United States, Black and Hispanic families have been disproportionately vulnerable to contracting COVID-19, to be hospitalized, and to die as a result of this illness. People of color have also been disproportionately represented among frontline workers who were at higher risk of contracting COVID-19 at work or while commuting, who included, for instance, nurses, grocery store workers, teachers, and construction workers. People of color have also been disproportionately affected by COVID-19's economic outfalls. Black and Hispanic workers were overrepresented, for instance, in those industries that were most affected by economic lockdowns, which includes the service and the retail industry. Moreover, as work by our Joint Center colleague, Whitney Obricki has shown, even before the pandemic, households of color and households working in industries that turned out to become most affected by lockdowns were already most at risk of experiencing housing insecurity, as they face significantly higher housing cost burdens compared to other groups even before the pandemic. So of course, during COVID-19, these inequalities have become aggravated, as our work will show. So in this talk and in our paper, we kind of bring these two literatures together to form our own theoretical model to better understand racial inequalities in housing insecurity during COVID-19. So first, we can look what it looked like prior to the pandemic. And at this time, of course, racial inequalities were already impacting which households were most vulnerable to experiencing housing insecurity. So these at that time, these unequal vulnerabilities were shaped by the legacies of historical inequalities and systemic racism, such as the homeownership gap, inequalities in education, income, and wealth. Then the pandemic introduced what we call a systemic shock. So we can see that on the one hand, this shock impacted many of the sort of pre-pandemic racialized vulnerabilities that already existed. For example, low-income and part-time workers were already the most precariously housed prior to the pandemic, but then due to the systemic shock of the pandemic, they also were most at risk of losing their job. So they sort of aggravated this existing pathway. At the same time, we argue the COVID-19 crisis also created new kind of pathways, what we call pandemic-induced inequalities, which created new pathways to racialized housing insecurity. For example, working in the leisure industry or retail, living in a multi-generational household, or coping with diabetes, these characteristics in themselves did not make households more vulnerable to housing, significantly more vulnerable to housing insecurity before the pandemic, but they gained new significance as vulnerabilities during this moment of systemic shock. So this created a new potential pathway to becoming housing insecure during the pandemic. So in order to kind of demonstrate this model and put it in practice, we draw on the household pulse survey, which is a nationally representative household survey from the US Census Bureau. This survey was specifically designed to help understand the unfolding social and economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic across the country. The survey has information on a range of household demographics, household vulnerabilities before the pandemic, as well as COVID's impacts on housing, health, income, and food insecurity. In our analysis, we pooled respondents from phases 2 and part of phase 3 of the survey, so putting together respondents from different weeks, which allows us to cover 9 weeks from August 19 through December 21st, 2020. And we excluded phase 1 of the survey as it was significantly different in some the questionnaire was different and survey design also diverged from later phases. So putting together these 9 weeks, our final sample size for our models is just over 442,000 households. So to isolate, if you think about isolating COVID-19's impact on housing insecurity, of course, in theory, it would be ideal to use a longitudinal survey that recorded data both before and during COVID's impacts. While there's been numerous surveys that measured COVID-19's economic impacts, the few longitudinal surveys that existed have either been more local in scope or they lacked the specific measure that we are interested in, which is measuring who was falling behind on their housing payments. For this reason, we chose to use the Household Pulse Survey, which is a publicly available data set and has a rich array of demographic variables and household information. As a nationally representative, large-scale survey, it allows us to analyze the nationwide impacts of the pandemic, including its pathways through pre-pandemic and pandemic-induced vulnerabilities. So if we look at our list of key variables that we use in our models, we use housing insecurity as sort of a key outcome variable, which is based on a survey question that asked whether households were caught up on their rent or mortgage payments during the time of the survey. Our key predictor to predict housing insecurity is the different race and ethnicity of households. And we also put in a range of baseline controls, keep other variation constant. Then later in our models, we include pre-pandemic vulnerabilities, which are listed right there. And finally, we include a range of variables that measure pandemic-induced inequalities. And our most important variable that I'd like to highlight here is what is called lost income since March 2020, which measured whether any household member had lost any type of employment income since March 2020. So this was a core way in which you could assess the pandemic's impact, financial impacts on households, and to what extent this shaped their housing insecurity, including for different types of groups. So to move on to our methodology, we will first, Alex will first present our findings in various descriptive statistics, showing to what extent households were behind on payments and how that varied by race and ethnicity. And then to better disentangle the role of various factors in shaping who was behind on payments, we then use linear probability models. And finally, we present our findings using predicted probabilities and some marginal effects, showing, for instance, how the event of income loss during COVID-19 had a different impact on the likelihood of falling behind on housing payments for different racial groups. So that allows us to kind of look more closely at the sort of conditional impact for different groups. So I will now move on to Alex, who will present our findings.
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much, Sharon. Hi, everyone. I'm Alex, obviously. Before I delve into our findings, I just want to say a quick thanks to Chris for inviting us and allowing us to present this work. And thanks to everyone watching for your interest in what we think is a pretty important topic that we hope to shed some light on. I'm going to talk to you about our empirical findings, starting with some very basic descriptive statistics. And that begins simply with the share of households experiencing housing insecurity in the first year of the pandemic. So between August and December 2020, about 12% of households across the country were behind on their rent or mortgage payment, which you can see on the far right hand side of the figure in front of you. Even at a quick glance, you'll notice that households of color are much more likely to be behind on their housing payments. So fully 23% of Black, 18% of Hispanic, and 15% of Asian households were behind on their rent or mortgage payments compared to 8% of white households. We know from the existing literature, from our own work at the Joint Center, and from some basic tabulations of the pulse survey data, that existing inequities, things that preceded the pandemic that Sharon already touched on, drive some of this disparity in housing insecurity, be they differences in homeownership attainment, education, household composition, household income. To illustrate that with a few examples from the pulse survey data we have here, here are the share of households who are homeowners by race and ethnicity. So just under 60% of all households in our sample own their home, but here again, disparities are obvious, right? About 2/3 of white households and 60% of Asian households own their homes, compared to under half of Hispanic and just 2/5 of Black households. There are also tremendous disparities in pre-pandemic household incomes. So this is the share of households here in the figure in front of you that had a household income in 2019 of $100,000 or greater. So here, 29% of all households were higher income, and that includes 46% of Asian, about 1/3 of white, 18% of Hispanic, and 15% of Black households. So even if you look at homeowners and renters separately, or if I had shown you high and low income households separately, or households with and without a bachelor's degree, et cetera, racial and ethnic disparities in housing insecurity will still persist. So here you see that Black, Hispanic, and Asian homeowners are far more likely to be behind on their mortgage payments than white homeowners. Likewise, renters of color are much more likely to be behind on their rent compared to white renters. Layered on top of those existing inequities are the pandemic-induced shocks that Sharon also highlighted. So this could take many forms, but most notably here for us today are those that result in a loss of employment income, so including from a job loss, a cutback in hours, or the need to take time off for health or caregiving duties. Income loss, in turn, along with other factors, can lead to newly sustained food insecurity and insufficiency. That will also be part of our models. But we know during the pandemic, there were significant disparities by race and ethnicity along these lines as well. So for example, we know that between March 2020 and roughly the second half of the year, about 46% of all households reported someone in their home had lost employment income. And that's the far right bar you see there. But that includes over half of Hispanic and Black households and about 2 in 5 white and Asian households. And just like the pre-pandemic inequities, even when you look at households who lost income and didn't lose income separately, racial and ethnic disparity still persists as it pertains to housing insecurity. So households who lost income and those who didn't lose income were more likely to be behind on their housing payments relative to white households. So let's take stock real quick of what we know. Households of color in the back half of 2020 are more likely to experience housing insecurity. We know that Black and Hispanic households in particular were more likely to have suffered from pre-pandemic vulnerabilities, which helped fuel these higher rates of housing insecurity. And we know that these households were also more likely to suffer from the financial fallout of the pandemic. But what we don't know is the relative importance of these factors. And just as importantly, we don't know if households of color are differentially impacted from the pandemic's financial fallout, independent of these other observed pre-pandemic inequities. So in other words, did the systemic shock of the pandemic exacerbate or disrupt existing inequities? The only way to start to answer some of these questions is through modeling. So now I'm going to present to you the results of a series of linear probability models, which is just a regression or just regression models where the dependent variable has a binary outcome. In this case, that binary outcome is 1 if a household reports being behind on their rent or mortgage. So that our measure of housing insecurity. In other words, I'm going to show you the relative difference in likelihood a household is behind on their payments associated with certain characteristics of that household while controlling for other characteristics. So I think some examples will be helpful, but a few more caveats are necessary. First, in no way are these estimates to be viewed as causal, they're associational. The data we have simply don't lend themselves to causal estimates, certainly not via the methods at our disposal here. And we'll talk more about that later and some of the challenges. I also just want to note, without getting too far into the weeds, that there are somewhat esoteric issues to have that make linear probability models imperfect. We're choosing to use this particular method here because of their relative ease of interpretation, especially when we start to introduce some interactive terms. But for those who are interested, we've run all these models as a logit, and the results replicate in terms of directionality, in terms of significance, but also relative magnitude for the most part in all of our models. This is the very first model and will help us get our feet wet a bit. This model, like all subsequent models, has the dependent variable as our indicator for housing insecurity. In this case, we have just one set of independent variables, the race and ethnicity of the respondent. Note that white households are the omitted group, so you read the coefficients in relation to that group. So here, Black households are 14.2 percentage points more likely to be behind on their housing payments than white households. Likewise, Hispanic households are 10 percentage points more likely, and Asian households 7 percentage points more likely than white households to be housing insecure. The 2 stars indicate that these relationships are statistically significant at the 99% confidence level. 1 star here would mean it's significant at the 95% confidence level. And because there are no additional controls in our model, these associations can simply be read as the difference in the likelihood each of these groups experiences housing insecurity relative to white houses. So we actually saw these estimates presented in a different way in our descriptive statistics. In model 2, we introduced what we're calling these baseline controls that Sharon mentioned previously, because they're not necessarily pre-pandemic vulnerabilities or pandemic-induced inequities, but instead they're basic demographic or household characteristics we want to control for. A plus sign instead of a precise coefficient indicates there's a positive association between that variable and the likelihood a household experiences housing insecurity. A negative sign indicates a negative association. So for example, retired respondents are less likely to be housing insecure, controlling for race, age, and all the other variables you see here. A Y indicates inclusion of a variable or a set of variables. Note that these models all build on top of one another. So the variables shown here, just race, so the variables shown previously, just race and ethnicity in this case, are all included in the current model, but we'll continue to build kind of on top of what we're showing you. We'll revisit the coefficients on race and ethnicity momentarily. But for now, I'm going to move on because in model 3, we're adding the full set of variables indicating pre-pandemic vulnerability to housing insecurity. So here, controlling for race and ethnicity, our baseline controls and other pre-pandemic vulnerabilities. Homeownership is associated with a 2.2 percentage point decrease in the likelihood a household is housing insecure. Similarly, having a bachelor's degree or having a rather high income, right, having an income of $100,000 or more is associated is also associated with a reduction in the likelihood of being housing insecure. In a substantial reduction, about 15 percentage point reduction in the case of having higher incomes relative to having much lower incomes. In model 4, we add the pandemic-induced vulnerabilities, which includes food sufficiency, the number of COVID cases and deaths per 100,000 in the state over the survey period, and our indicator for whether or not a household lost employment income. And here, controlling for everything else in our model, the red kind of coefficient at the very bottom here, losing employment income since the start of the pandemic is associated with an 8 percentage point increase in the likelihood a household is behind on their rent or mortgage. So what happens to the relationship between race and ethnicity and housing insecurity as we begin to control for baseline characteristics, pre-pandemic vulnerabilities, and pandemic-induced inequalities? These are the results from all 4 of the models I've just shown, but only showing the coefficients on race and ethnicity. As a reminder, in model 1 with no controls, households of color are between 7 and 14 percentage points more likely to be behind on their housing payments relative to white households. But when we introduce our baseline controls in model 2, the coefficients on race and ethnicity don't change much at all, right? And they now range from 6 to 13 percentage point differences. But as we begin to control for pre-pandemic inequities in model 3, these coefficients begin to change more substantially. So when accounting for pre-pandemic inequities and baseline controls, Black households are 9 percentage points, Hispanic households are 4.5 percentage points, and Asian households are 7 percentage points more likely to be housing insecure. Model 4 on the far right side includes all of these controls plus the pandemic-induced inequities. The first thing to point out is that the disparities in housing insecurity between white households and households of color simply persists, right? So even after controlling for age, for pre-pandemic income, for differences in home ownership rates, for differences in who lost employment income as a result of the pandemic, all of these things and all the things we've shown previously, Black and Asian households are still about 8 percentage points more likely than white households to be behind on their housing payments. And Hispanic households are about 3 percentage points more likely. Some of this almost certainly reflects what is called omitted variable bias, and one of the reasons why we can't interpret these estimates as causal. There are other characteristics of these households that we could not include in our model, right? Their wealth, the strengths of their social networks, more detailed geographic information, occupational data, housing costs, many things, right? That would explain some of this difference. But these persistent disparities also very likely reflect longstanding and continued discrimination in the housing market, such as the kind of discrimination that is well documented in audit studies, for example. Another thing that's notable is the persistently high likelihood that Asian households are behind on their housing payments. So recall that Asian households were more likely in the descriptive statistics to be behind on their rent or mortgage relative to white households, despite having higher incomes, despite their relatively high homeownership rates and similar rates of experiencing an income loss. So when we compare otherwise similar Asian and white households in later models, these inequalities are only further aggravated as it relates to housing insecurity. So the housing challenges of Asian households during the crisis and past crises is a topic worthy of further inquiry. It could be driven by housing market discrimination or the challenges of Asian households in particular geographic markets, especially more local data than what we have access to at this time. Beyond the persistence of these disparities in housing insecurity, we also want to ask the question, how lost income, a specific financial shock that occurred during the pandemic, moderates the association between race, ethnicity, and housing insecurity. So in other words, we know that households of color were more likely to experience an income loss during the first year of the pandemic, but what did this financial fallout, disproportionately impact households of color and their housing insecurity? To answer that question, we run a 5th model shown here that takes everything we did previously in our 4th model, interacts race and ethnicity with our indicator for lost employment income. We look at this graphically in just a moment, but note the coefficients and the significance of the estimates on the bottom in red here. So relative to white households who also experienced an income loss, Black households experiencing an income loss were 8 percentage points more likely to be behind on their rent or mortgage payment. Again, controlling for baseline characteristics, pre-pandemic vulnerabilities, and other pandemic-induced inequities. So Hispanic households were also significantly more likely than white households to experience housing insecurity following a financial shock. Asian households were significantly less likely. And again, I'll show you in a moment what this looked like. But I want to begin to tie a bow around this and bring us out of the world of regression tables. And to do that, I'm taking model 5 and showing you graphically what it implies about the likelihood a household experiences housing insecurity. So these are predicted probabilities, and they hold all other variables in our model constant at the mean, and imply that under these conditions, about 18% of Asian and Black households and 13% of Hispanic households would be expected to experience housing insecurity compared to 10% of white households. As we saw before, households of color are significantly more likely to experience housing insecurity even after controlling for pre-pandemic vulnerabilities and in a pandemic-induced financial shock. And relative to white households, these differences are statistically significant. How do these predicted probabilities vary with an income shock? So regardless of whether they lost income or didn't lose income, households of color were more likely to experience housing insecurity. For those losing employment income, about a quarter of Black households would be expected to be behind on their rent or mortgage. 1/5 of Asian households, and then about 18.5% of Hispanic households, and 14% of white households. Among those financially unaffected in this way, Asian households were expected to have the highest rates of housing insecurity, higher than Hispanic and even Black households. Another way to look at this, what's the expected difference in the likelihood a household would experience housing insecurity if they were to lose employment income? So the pandemic and induced financial shock meant the greatest harm for Black households. So Black households who lost income would expect to be 14 percentage points more likely to be housing insecure than a Black household who didn't lose income. For Hispanic households, the difference is about 9 percentage points. For white households, it's just under 7 percentage points. And for Asian households, it's only 4 percentage points. On some level, this likely reflects the severity of income loss that different households likely experience, right? There's a difference between losing your job outright and maybe having to take some time off for COVID-related reasons due to health or caregiving, or even having to take a couple of shifts off early on in the pandemic. So there's major differences in how income loss might be experienced in that way. But in any case, this shows how the pandemic itself and its financial fallout has exacerbated existing inequities in housing insecurity, especially as it relates to Black and Hispanic households, who are both far more likely to suffer a loss of employment income, but also much more likely to experience housing insecurity as a result of that income loss. I'm going to reiterate a few key findings before wrapping up with a few high-level conclusions. We hope to have shed some light on a few basic trends, right? First of all, households of color were more likely to be behind on their rent and mortgage payment in the second half of 2020. This disparity holds true even after accounting for existing vulnerabilities that precede the pandemic and pandemic-induced vulnerabilities. Lastly, we hope to have shown that Black and Hispanic households are not only more likely to have suffered a financial shock as a result of the pandemic, but this financial shock was more likely to make them experience housing insecurity or fall behind on their housing payments as a result. In other words, the systemic shock of the pandemic reinforced and exacerbated existing inequities in housing insecurity by race and ethnicity. What does this mean in the big picture? Housing insecurity is widespread despite substantial federal, state, and local supports. It's important to note that unprecedented financial supports in the form of expanded unemployment insurance in particular almost certainly mitigated a great deal of the housing insecurity that would have been experienced otherwise, but it also did not eliminate the additional harm the systemic shock of the pandemic and its financial fallout had on households of color. For this reason, policies providing financial assistance should be targeted towards communities with the greatest need, and we need to ensure assistance already out there, think emergency rental assistance in particular, right, actually reaches the groups that have been most impacted by the crisis. Lastly, much more scholarship and policy attention has been paid to the housing challenges of the housing challenges of Black and Hispanic households, but Asian households, despite their relative advantages, also experience housing insecurity at relatively high rates during the pandemic. Our data preclude exploring whether or not geography, housing costs, differences in Asian subgroups, right, or housing discrimination faced by Asian Americans played a substantial role in this, but additional research should shed some light on these challenges. With that, I'm going to say thanks to everyone. We're looking forward to questions and discussions, and I think Sharon and Chris are both going to join me in doing that. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point as well.
Great, thank you both. I think a very clear presentation and very compelling findings. So those of you who are watching the presentation, if you submit your questions through the Q&A function, we will do our best to get to them. Let me start, Alex and Sharon, by I guess one sort of small methodological question is that you focused on the second half of 2020, which is obviously a year ago now. A lot has happened since then. Do you have any sense of to what extent your findings may differ if you looked at a different period or more contemporary period?
Yeah, I think the reason for sticking with the 2020 is more practical, than any reason not to. We've obviously, with you, Chris, working on a paper with you, which is using similar methods with slightly different research questions, but exploring some of these same challenges using housing insecurity as a means of assessing some other related questions. And even in that work, right, which is focused on the end of 2020 and early 2021, you're still seeing similar disparities by race and ethnicity. I wouldn't expect major differences in kind of our outcome in our key findings if we had looked kind of more recently, but I think our intention here was to focus on kind of the immediate aftermath, like the financial shock that occurred in 2020 as the pandemic was setting out. And given the pulse survey, its timing, some of the differences in the pulse survey as it changed over time, it made sense to focus on the back half of 2020 to kind of assess that. I don't know if you have anything to add, Sharon.
No, I think it made sense to focus on this period as this was sort of the height of economic lockdowns when the sort of financial fallout was most immediate and acute. So I think that's why we initially chose to focus on this period. But yeah, I appreciate your question, Chris. I think it is interesting to kind of look at, like, okay, what happened, because it is, what's interesting about the survey is that it is still ongoing. So there's still, the last data that was published was from like the last week of October. So I think that's another great feature of the survey is that it's so longitudinal during COVID. So I do think that it is a great resource for researchers everywhere, that it has this like long view. But we really want to document, like, this is the systemic shock really impacted people during this immediate moment. So this is what we want to impact. But I appreciate sort of like idea of like thinking even further on.
Yeah, and there's a certain amount of this is obviously, as you're documenting here, is structural. And so given that those broader structures of inequality haven't changed, one would expect that those things would be persistent. There's a bunch of methodological questions. Let me just ask a few of them. One of them was someone who was asking about the fact that your dependent variable is binary, behind on housing payments or not. People are asking about whether or not the amount of being behind is available. And from the pulse, it's not, but have you thought about the kind of the question about the degree of being behind and how that might factor into your findings?
Yeah, as you said, it's certainly not available, not in the pulse survey, and not generally available. It's a relatively new question that the pulse survey asked. It's not something that's commonly been asked in other surveys about housing. I guess it's harder to think about what would mean for our findings. I'd expect you'd see greater disparities in the amount owed by these groups by race and ethnicity, but I also don't know that for a fact, but that would be at least be my expectation. I don't know, Sharon, if you have thoughts on that as well.
And you don't have to, Sharon, if
that's okay. Yeah.
There's an interesting question too, that that having adjusted for numerous variables, and the fact then that race is associated with being further behind on rent payments. Is there a way in which there might be an interpretation which says that people of color are less responsible about their debt payments, and so you have an unexplained portion that's associated with race? This is a similar question that came up when we were recently presenting work that Sophia Wadeen was presenting, about the fact that all else equal, people were less likely to pay their rent. And so how do you answer that question? Is there some way in which this is suggesting that people of color are less credit responsible? Provocative question, I realize, but I think it's one that's in the chat. But I put it to you.
Yeah, and it's the question Sophia answered 2 weeks ago, in a sense, right? In that paper that the two of us worked on with Sophia and with another co-author, Whitney Bricky, right? Kind of determined that regardless of if households who fell behind on their rent were engaging in numerous strategies to keep up with their housing payments, right? Doing significant gymnastics, if you will, relying on family and friends, using higher leverage debt in some cases, using public assistance when available, and using whatever basically incomes or whatever supports were available to them in that moment, whatever sources of income they could to keep up with their housing payments. In those strategies, in the complexity of those strategies, by race and ethnicity, but they were always prevalent. So drawing on that other work, I'd say that's probably short-sighted. What we're not picking up in our models that would continue to explain some of these differences are, like we mentioned previously, the kind of omitted variables that are things that we would love to be able to incorporate in our models, be it household wealth, what kinds of social networks you have access to, what your housing payments actually are, and then there are the other things around legacies of housing discrimination that Sharon talked about so eloquently in the first part of the presentation. So all those things are going to play a role more so than what that question might suggest, I think, Chris.
Great. And Sharon, I'll keep an eye on your microphone. If you want to add anything, you can come off and jump in. But I'll take your silence to mean that you don't want to add. There's another question related to the issue of gender. Matt Desmond's work around housing insecurity and eviction really highlights the fact that the issue, the challenge, the plague of eviction is most problematic for women of color. African-American women in particular. So obviously you've highlighted the fact that this is housing insecurity here is much more predominant among people of color. What role did gender play in your findings? And is there a way in which that corroborates Matt Desmond's observation about how women in particular are affected by this?
I think it's a great question. We have discussed this too, it's something that we have wanted to look at in more depth. One weakness of this design is that we only have so the household wealth survey is a household survey, so we only have the gender of the respondent. So the person who happened to respond to the survey, that is the gender that is recorded for that household. So we have gender, but it just means that it just refers to the person who responded to the survey. So we don't really know if it means that a woman happened to pick up happened to fill out the survey online, or whether it's in fact a female-headed household. It doesn't mean it's the same. So I think that's sort of it could be a proxy for that, but it's not identical. So I think that is not something that we can directly say. But gender is in some of Alex's models. So what? Yeah,
and the models do suggest that when kind of especially after we start controlling for things and income and the pandemic-induced inequities, that female-headed households are I guess as you said, not female-headed households, but female respondents are less likely to be behind on their housing payments, and that difference is statistically significant. It's not the focus of this work, even if it's something we've discussed, something we've included, and it's important. It's an important question, but not necessarily something we looked at very deeply. But our models would, in some ways, potentially suggest the opposite, though at a very small level, a difference of less than a percentage point, seriously.
There are also been a series of questions related to geography. I'll try to encapsulate them to give you a chance to talk about the spatial aspects of your findings. One is that whether or not the pulse survey tends to focus on urban areas. To what extent is it representative of different geographies? I think the other question is, given the significant racial segregation that we have in this country, are there consequences spatially for your findings? And there was a question too about might there be an influence of settlement patterns, which I guess maybe is the same way of saying, is there ways in which geographic concentration of people of color may have affected their more greatly impacted? But how are you thinking about space, and what can you say about space in your analysis?
This analysis, to the extent we can control for geography at all, it's largely at the state level, right? So the household pulse survey is a nationally representative survey of adults living in households across the country, and their sampling frame takes you state by state, and they produce estimates state by state. And the way we control for this, our models, is with state fixed effects, right? So on some level, that's going to get at geographic differences to an extent, geographic differences potentially in housing costs, but certainly not at the local level. To plug yet another paper that we're working on, that we hope to explore the differences in housing insecurity at smaller levels of geography using internal pulse survey census bureau data. But for this paper, we weren't really able to do that. So our ability to answer those questions directly or empirically is more challenging. I don't, Sharon, if you have thoughts on what theoretically might, how those ideas might impact our results, or any other thoughts on, I know I only touched on one of those three questions.
Yeah, I think these are super interesting questions. I'm very interested in that. Like so far, right now in this paper, we only control for state, as Alex was saying, and we control for state kind of in two ways: by the state fixed effects, and also by including COVID rates per 100,000 at various times per state. So to kind of control for like both state policies, like economic policies, as well as health policies, that kind of vary at a state level, but of course is a very kind of large scale way to kind of think about geography. I think future work, including by using the household pulse survey, like they do, if you like, it's not publicly available, but if you are a researcher, like you could apply for more micro level data. So I think that there is some richness potentially to be mined there for more local variation. I also really like the question about the spatialized impact, and I think this is important also for policymakers to think about what this means. Like if like households of color, if Hispanic and Black households are disproportionately impacted by the economic outfalls of COVID-19, including falling behind on their rent, of course, this is also going to disproportionately impact Black and Hispanic communities, right? So this also means that our policies have to respond to this also geographically. So I think we can think about a two-pronged approach here, not just target individuals, but also think about targeting communities that are like have had the biggest impact. So I do think this is a very important way to think about sort of the impact of these things. Yeah.
Geography matters a lot. We're unfortunately constrained by what's allowable in the pulse survey for us right now.
But we do have the opportunity to do some of that analysis, which will be forthcoming sometime early next year, we hope. So don't want to put any pressure on you, Alex. Or maybe I do.
Never.
We have a little more than 5 minutes left, a bunch of questions. Let me see if I can get to a few of them. One was related to question about owners versus renters, and your sample includes both. And I think you show that 60% of the sample of the pulse is owner occupied, slightly less actually than the overall sample of households. So that's interesting by itself. But obviously during COVID, an enormous amount of attention, rightly so, has been paid to renters behind on rent, in large part because for much of the pandemic, there were limited availability of getting money into the hands of renters. Now there is, well, it's getting out there. Homeowners are much more readily protected by forbearance programs. But to what extent did you find, did you parse your results by owner renter, and were how much worse off are renters and owners in the racial context?
Sorry. So we did, especially with earlier models, and something we need to kind of revisit now that we've more fully developed our method. But in the kind of logit models that I had mentioned previously, we had different stratifications, right? Including one that looked at things separately by tenure. And almost surprisingly, like the differences were minimal, right? Which is why we combined them in the first place and presented them as kind of one thing. The racial differences in how they were mediated by income losses weren't that different, right? If you looked at homeowners and renters separately. And I think that still holds true with our current method, but yeah, it's something we'll need to revisit certainly before we submit for publication, right? Another thing that's kind of worth noting is once you get to kind of our more developed models, once you account for differences in income and the pandemic-induced financial shocks, tenure kind of falls out as at least a significant predictor in our model, and that's true both in this iteration of the model, the one that we presented today, and previous iterations. So tenure, we think, matters, but probably is subsumed by some of the other characteristics we're controlling for, be it education, income, race, geography, like things like that. I don't know, Sharon, if you want to speak to. I mean,
I just wanted to add that it is important to note that in our when we talk about homeowners, we only include homeowners that are still paying a mortgage. So I think an important inequality, of course, already happens the moment, like there's an important inequality of homeowners who have already paid off their mortgage. So they're not included because they're not, in theory, like they cannot fall behind on their payments to begin with. So
our universe under study are homeowners with a mortgage and renters who have payments, right? Which is most of both, but that's why you have that 60% shift too. That's why it's only 60% of the sample is homeowners rather than like 2/3, Chris, by the way.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, as we come to the close, I guess a high-level question for you all to think about is, how do you hope these findings will be utilized by fellow researchers, policymakers, or the broader public? What difference do you hope these findings make? Maybe we'll let Sharon start.
So that's a great question. I personally really hope that, I think there's been a lot of, it's been great to see how much this particular systemic shock, this crisis, has really prompted a sort of immediate federal response. I think there's been a lot of policy proactive policy responses, like the emergency rental assistance program, like the moratoria, sort of income assistance. There's been a lot of sort of very broad programs to kind of help like renters and homeowners kind of get through this pandemic, basically. So I think that's been really great to see, especially in contrast to some other systemic shocks. But based on this presentation and data, I think what we show is also the inequalities of the systemic shock itself. Like the shock itself has not been experienced equally by different households. Like it's been a deeply racialized experience and shock. The pandemic's been deeply racialized. Income loss has been deeply racialized, but then also the sort of consequence of income loss has been different for different groups, right? So even among those people that suffered income loss, the impact on housing insecurity has been different for different groups. So my hope is that this will prompt local, states, federal policymakers to think more deeply about, okay, how can we now in the next phase target policies more specifically to those communities and groups that need it most. So I think we've gone from this sort of very broad, general kind of for everyone sort of supports, and I think we're at a stage where we can kind of target more specifically to the groups that need it most, which we show it's very much Hispanic and Black renters, homeowners as well, and we kind of highlight the sort of the Asian housing insecurity that I don't think a lot of researchers have looked at before. So I hope that will be taken up. That's my hope. Yeah.
Alex, last words?
Yeah, just to reiterate that, I think broad-based supports that aren't especially targeted are important and good, but it's not an either or proposition, right? It's an and proposition. You also need to if the point is to reduce housing insecurity, or if the point is to reduce the harms of the pandemic, also doing something that is particularly well targeted towards people who are most likely to experience that housing insecurity is the only way to really get at that and succeed in that ultimately. So.
Great. Well, let me thank you both for some really interesting and provocative work. I think you've done a very nice job, both in the framing of this and then in the execution as well. I think it will be an important way of highlighting the significant racial inequalities that pre-exist shocks like this, as you said, systemic shocks, and are exacerbated by them. So thank you for the work. For those of you watching at home, stay tuned. The paper will be forthcoming. I know they've been working hard at it. I also want to remind you that our next event is November 30th. Can we finally close racial homeownership gaps? Insight from 3 new initiatives. That's at 4:30 in the afternoon. So we hope to see you again for that. But in the meantime, thank you for watching. Thank you, Alex and Sharon, and be well and enjoy the weekend, everyone.
Thank you.